Hello, and welcome to Toya in Stitches. Today we're going to be making a beginner-friendly, perfect for summer crochet top. So let's jump in. To make our top, we're going to need our yarn, a corresponding hook, stitch markers, scissors, tape measure, and a tapestry needle. The yarn I'm using is a category 2 sport weight yarn. It is this one. It is Heatherly Sport from We Crochet. This one is 80% acrylic and 20% merino wool. And in this hank, you're going to get 328 yards for the 100 grams. I'm also using a 4.5 millimeter hook, but you can go ahead and choose the yarn and hook of your choice. Just be mindful of the fiber content and the weight of the yarn that you're choosing, because this top is designed for summer wear. Those things will affect the result or how cool or warm the top will be. So go ahead and grab your supplies and we'll get started. To make this top, you're going to need to make note of 3 measurements. First, you're going to want to note your bust measurement. So go ahead and measure around the widest part of your bust and note that number. Next is your armhole depth, which you measure from the top of your shoulder to where your arm opens up. Now for your top length, just measure from the top of your shoulder to where you want the hem of your top to end. All right, so our top is constructed in 2 rectangular panels that we're going to put together and fold in half to form our top at the end. So we'll start by making the first panel together, and then I'll leave you to make the second one. Then we'll come back and sew everything together. So to start, we're gonna need to make our chain. If you're working from the pattern, chain the specified number of stitches for your size. For this tutorial, I'm going to be making the large because I'm going to be gifting it to someone. And for the large, we would chain 185 stitches. So whatever size you're going to be making, if you're working from the pattern, just chain the specified number of stitches for your size. If you're going to be making adjustments to the length of the top, just know that you need to do that in multiples of 3. So whether you're going to be adding some length or subtracting, just do that in multiples of 3. If you're not working from the pattern, you need to be chaining a multiple of 3 plus 2, because your chain needs to be twice the length of your desired top length. So say you want your top to be about 20 inches, your chain is going to need to be 40 inches long. So you would chain a multiple of 3 until your chain is about a ½ inch less than you want it to be. So if you're working with a 20-inch top, your chain needs to be 40 inches. So you're going to chain until you get to 39.5 inches, and then you'll just add 2 more chains. So we're going to start by just working our chain. So whether you're working from the pattern or you're just going to chain until your chain is as long as you need it to be, just go ahead and make your chain. I'm going to be chaining my 185 stitches. And one little tip I like to do is I like to mark every 20 chains just so it's easier to count once I get to the end of my chain. And I like using these little split stitch markers just because they're easier to insert and remove when I'm working the chain. So I'm going to start by just yarning over, pulling through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and then I would just take my little stitch marker, slip it into that chain, and just continue chaining until I get to the length I need or until I have reached the specified number of chains for my size. Okay, so I've completed my chain. So now it's time for us to start row 1. And we're going to start the row by working a stacked single crochet in the very first chain from the hook. So not pulling on your yarn because you don't want to put too much tension on this chain here. You're just going to insert your hook into that first chain. I like working into the bottom loop of the chain, but you can work into the chain anywhere you're comfortable. So I insert into the chain, yarn over, and pull up a loop. Then I'm going to yarn over and work a single crochet. Now I'm going to insert my hook under this loop right here. So just insert my hook under that loop right there, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both loops on the hook, and that would be our first stitch, which is a stacked single crochet. I'll do that for you again. So into the first chain, we're going to insert our hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both loops on our hook, and now we're going to insert our hook into this loop right here. Yarn over, pull up a loop, and then just yarn over and pull through both loops on the hook. So that's our stacked single crochet. So in the next chain, we're going to work a double crochet. So I'm going to yarn over, insert into the chain, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two. So those are our first two stitches. So now I'm going to chain one, skip one chain, and work a double crochet in the next two chains. So yarn over, that's one, and two. So that's what it should look like so far. So we have our first two stitches, a chain one, and we've skipped one chain, and then two double crochets, and that's what we're going to repeat along our chain. We're going to chain one, skip one chain, and then work a double crochet in the next two chains. So yarn over, we've already chained one, skip that chain, and then we're going to work into the next chain, and a double crochet in the next one, chain one, skip one chain, double crochet in the next two chains, and again, chain one, skip one chain, double crochet in the next two chains, and you're going to repeat that all the way to the end of your chain, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so I've completed my first row, so now we're going to start on row two. We're going to turn, and we're going to work a stacked single crochet in our first stitch. So without chaining, you're going to insert your hook into the first stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both loops on your hook. And like we did for row one, you're going to insert your hook under this loop right here, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both loops, and the stacked single crochet will be your first stitch of every row. So I'll work that again. So without chaining, you're going to insert your hook into the first stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both loops on the hook, and then you're going to insert your hook under this loop right here. So you're going to insert your hook under that loop, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through both loops on your hook. So that's your first stitch. So now we're going to work a double crochet in the next stitch. Then we're going to chain one. We're going to skip this chain right here and work a double crochet in the next two double crochets. So yarn over into the top of the next double crochet, work one double crochet and a double crochet in the next. So that's how your row two is starting to look. We're going to be working double crochets into the tops of double crochets, and we're going to chain over the chain that we made from the previous row. So chain one, skip the chain space, yarn over, double crochet in the next stitch and the next stitch, chain one, skip that chain space, double crochet in the next stitch, double crochet in the next stitch. So you're going to continue working like that, chaining one, skipping the chain, and working a double crochet in the top of the 2 double crochets from the previous row. And you're going to continue doing that all the way to the end of your row, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so I've completed my row 2. So now from this point, I would repeat row 2 for a specific number of rows based on the pattern. For this size, the large, I'm going to work until I get to row 22. So if you're working from the pattern, just do your row 2 repeat up to the specified row for your size. So again, for me, that's going to be row 22. And once you've completed those rows, come back and we'll finish off our final row of this panel. If you're not working from the pattern, what you will do is you're going to take your bust measurement. So whatever your bust measurement is, you're going to add 2 inches. So say, for example, your bust is 34. You're going to add 2 inches, and then you're going to divide that number by 4. So 36 divided by 4 would give you 9 inches. So you're going to continue repeating row 2 until your panel is 9 inches wide. So go ahead and do that, and then you'll come back and we'll work the final row. Okay, so once you have completed your panel by working the specified number of rows for your size, or worked until your panel measures a quarter of your bust measurement. For me, I'm making the large, so my panel based on the pattern has 22 rows, or if you're working based on your measurements, my completed bust is 44, so my panel should be about 11 inches, which is pretty much what I have now. So we're ready to move on to our final row, which is just working a row of half double crochet. So what we will do from this point on is we're going to chain 1 and turn. So I chain 1, turn, and I'm going to work a half double crochet in each stitch and chain space as we go across our row. So I'm going to yarn over, insert into my first stitch, yarn over, pull through all 3, again, yarn over, insert into the next stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all 3 loops. And now we're going to work a half double crochet into the chain space. So we're going to yarn over, just insert into the chain space, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all 3. And we're going to repeat that all the way across the row. So again, yarn over, half double crochet in the next stitch, yarn over, half double crochet in the next stitch, and now yarn over and half double crochet into the chain space. And we're just going to continue working half double crochet stitches into the tops of stitches and into the chain space all the way across your row. And I'll meet you when we get to the end of the row. So I have now completed my row of half double crochet. And what we're going to do before we cut our yarn and fasten off is we're going to measure out about a 30-inch tail that we'll use to sew the 2 panels together. So I'm just going to grab my tape measure and then I'm just going to measure out about 30 inches of yarn. And then I'm going to cut my yarn. Then I'll just work a slip stitch and pull that tail all the way through. Tighten that down. So now I have a tail that I'm going to use to sew it up. And now our first panel is complete. So now go ahead and repeat this entire process to make your second panel. Once your second panel is finished, then come back and we'll sew it all together. All right, so once we have our 2 panels finished, we need to start sewing it all together. And when it comes to sewing everything together, we need to work in stitches. So we need to know exactly how many stitches we have. So what you're going to do first of all is just count exactly how many stitches you have. For me, I have 185 stitches. Now what I'm going to do is divide that number by 2, which gives me 92.5. What does it mean when you get a 0.5? So pretty much for me, for one panel, I'm going to have 92 stitches on one end and 92 stitches going the other way with 1 stitch in between. So I will place a stitch marker in that stitch. Now, if your number is evenly divisible by 2. So say I had a number of stitches where when I divide it, I just got 92. What I would do is mark stitch number 92 here and stitch number 92 here. So I would have 2 stitch markers. So if everything you have is evenly divided by 2, so say you had 20 and you divided by 2 and you have 10, you're going to put a stitch marker in the 10th stitch from one end. So you would count up from one end, 10, put a stitch marker, from the other end, 10, put a stitch marker. So then you will have 2 stitch markers that mark the center line of your piece. So for me, I'll take that one out. So then what I did after I found my center stitch, which now forms the center line, which is where it's going to get folded, I follow that line, which mine ended in a chain space. So I followed that chain space all the way to the other end, to the outer edge, and I placed a stitch marker in there as well. So now I know from either side where the halfway mark of my panel will be. So once we have that figured out, we're just gonna lay our pieces together with the rows of half double crochet coming together, because the rows of half double crochet is the center of our garment. So now our next step is measuring out our front neckline, which I measured out to be about 8 inches. That's how deep I made my neckline. I will show you how to make an adjustment if you want it deeper or if you want it to come up a little bit higher. But for now, we're just going to measure out 8 inches. So what I did was from my center line, I take my tape measure and I place this 0 line right beside that stitch marker. And then I measure down 8 inches and then I mark the stitch where my 8 inches stop. If you're working from the pattern says when you're working for your front neckline, you're going to sew up X number of stitches from the hem. What does that mean? You're going to count from this end upwards that number of stitches. So for this size, it says to sew up from the hem 58 stitches. So I would count from here all the way up until I got 58. This stitch here is number 58, so I mark the next stitch. So if you're working from the pattern, you count up from the hem the number of stitches specified for your size, and when you get to that number, mark the next stitch, because you have to sew up 58 stitches for this size or whichever size you're working for from the pattern. But if you're not, just measure out your neckline and then put a stitch marker, and then you know everything below that stitch marker is where you have to sew. So to sew this up, I'm going to be using the mattress stitch. So now I'll show you how I do that and then we'll complete this front seam here. All right, so I have my yarn on my tapestry needle and I'm gonna start sewing from the hem upwards. And why I do that is when I sew from this end going up towards the neckline, I can leave my tail before sewing that in, try the top on, and if I want the neckline to come down lower or go up higher, I can either pull out the seam or sew it up a little bit more just to make any adjustments before I weave in my ends. Versus if you sewed from where your stitch marker is coming down toward the hem, if you try it on and then you realize the neckline isn't exactly how you want it, then you're going to have to pull out the entire seam. So I just like going from this end going up. So if I need to make adjustments, my yarn is in the right place for either sewing up some more or to pull it out. So I'm going to start doing the mattress stitch. So I'm going to come in from below the stitch, so from the inside of the stitch coming up toward me on the left side. I'm going to pull the tail through, and then I'm going to do the same going on the other side. So I'm going to lift it up and going from the inside coming up toward me, and I'm going to pull it up, and I'm going to continue doing that. So going from the inside out on one side to the inside out of the corresponding stitch, just like so. And then what I do is when I get about 6 or 8 stitches up, I'm gonna pull on my yarn just to tighten that section of the seam and then continue working. And when I pull on it, I hold one end. So I'm just gonna place my finger firmly on one end and then pull on the working end to pull the seam together. And then I'm gonna continue working. I'm just going to continue doing that until I get to my stitch marker. So you go ahead, continue sewing up this seam, stopping where you've put your stitch marker. And then when I come back, we'll do the same thing on the back of or top. Okay, so I finished my front seam. Now I'm going to work on the back. And the neckline in the back is 5 inches deep. So what you will do is, if you're not working from the pattern, you're going to measure 5 inches from your center stitch marker down and then mark the stitch. So you're just going to grab your tape measure and mark out 5 inches from where your center stitch marker is, and you're just going to place a stitch marker where you hit the 0, and that's going to be your 5-inch neckline for the back. If you're working from the pattern, it's going to tell you to sew up from the hem a specific number of stitches. For my large here, that says to sew up from the hem 71 stitches. So what you will do is, from the hem, you will count 71 stitches, and when you get to stitch number 71, mark the next stitch, because you're going to sew up all 71 stitches. So once you have your stitch markers placed, then you'll just put your yarn on your tapestry needle and then just sew right up to your stitch marker. So we'll go ahead and do that now. So just like we did on the front, we're going to repeat it on the back. We're just going to put our yarn onto our tapestry needle, and we're just going to start from the left side, working the yarn under that stitch and then under the corresponding stitch on the other side on the right. And then we're just going to continue going from left to right, from the inside of the stitch, coming out toward us, going right up the seam and stopping where you placed your stitch marker. So just go ahead and sew up this back seam, and then we'll come in and we will measure out our armholes, and then we'll sew up the side seams. So go ahead and do that, and I'll meet you once you've completed sewing up your back. All right, so now that we have our front and our back seams finished, now it's time to measure out our armhole and then just sew up our side seams. So from your center line, if you're not working from the pattern, you're going to just measure out from the center stitch marker down to how deep you want your armhole to be. So say you want your armhole to be 8 inches, you would put your 0 line beside your stitch marker and just measure out until you get to 8 inches, and then just place a stitch marker where you land on the 8. Just place a stitch marker there, and then you're going to repeat that on the other side. So you're going to just place your stitch marker, place your tape measure beside your stitch marker at 8, and then just measure down, mark where you hit 0. So then now you have 8 inches measured out. And then once you've measured it out, just make sure you have an even number of stitches on either side, just to make sure everything is even and it lines up nicely. If you're working from the pattern, it tells you to sew up from the hem a certain number of stitches, and as we had done with our front and back seam, you're just going to count your stitches from the hem upwards toward the center. And for this, it said to sew up 71 stitches, so you would count from the hem upwards, and once you get to stitch 71, you would place a stitch marker right beside that, because you're going to sew from the hem up to stitch 71. So once you have your stitches or your measurements marked out using stitch markers, you're going to repeat these measurements on the other side, and then you're going to fold your top in half. Okay, so I have my top folded in half. So what I'm going to do is take a locking stitch marker, and those 2 stitch markers that I had placed when I was counting out my stitches, I'm just going to replace them with a locking stitch marker, just so the front and the back will now stay together. And I did that on the other side as well. And then all you're going to do now is just take one side and you're going to bring them together. Just lay them as flat as you can and line up your rows. So just make sure everything is lining up nice and evenly. So 2 stitches together with 2 stitches, chain spaces sitting right next to each other all the way down. And then you're just going to work your mattress stitch right from the hem all the way up your seam, making sure that you're working into the corresponding stitches as you go up your seam. But one thing I would like to show you is when I am working my seam, I like to take my tapestry needle and instead of going into the chain space when I'm working, I pick up the 2 top loops of that chain stitch. So when you seam it together, the yarn is going to come under the top 2 loops and over like the little bottom bar right there, just so the seam looks nice and clean once you're finished. So as I said, when you're sewing everything up, make sure everything sits nice and neat. And when you're going through your chain spaces, just go through and go right under the 2 top loops there, just like so. Just to make sure your seam is nice and neat. So go ahead and sew up your side seams. Then I'll come in and we'll just do our finishing rows of half double crochet around our arms and on the hem. So go ahead, sew up your side seams, and then we'll come back and finish off. All right, so all my seaming is done. I've done my front, my back, and my side seams. So now it's time for us to do our finishing rows around the armhole and the hem. So I'm going to start off with the armhole. So we're just going to work a row of half double crochet all the way around the armhole. So I'm just going to get my yarn and I'm going to insert my hook. So for the armhole, I'm going to be working into the chain spaces, but for my very first one, I'm going to actually insert my hook under the top 2 loops of that chain. Yours might not be a chain space, it might just be a regular stitch, but if it is a chain space, just go under the top 2 loops of that chain stitch. And then now I'm going to grab my yarn. And I don't want there to be a knot, so I'm just going to loop it over my finger like so, and then just grab it with my hook. And then I'm going to pull it through. I'm going to separate the tail from the working end. I'm just going to leave the tail on one side, grab the working end, and I'm going to hold onto the tail with my other finger. Then I'm going to chain 1. Now I'm going to yarn over and insert my hook under the top 2 loops of that stitch there again, and then work a half double crochet. And then now I'm going to work a half double crochet in the next stitch. And the next stitch. And then when I get to the chain space, I'm just going to work directly into the chain space and then into the top of the next stitch, just like so, and then into the chain space. And you're just going to continue doing that all the way around the armhole, and I'll meet you at the end and show you how to fasten it off. All right, so I have worked all the way around my armhole and I haven't slip stitched to my first stitch. That's not how I'm going to fasten off. You can fasten off in your preferred method, or I will show you how I do it. So I'm just gonna pull the end of my yarn through my stitch. I'm going to string it onto a tapestry needle. And then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go under the top 2 loops of the next stitch. Then I'm going to tilt it toward me so I can see the inside of the stitches. And then for the last stitch I made on the other side, so I came under the top 2 loops of my first stitch, And now on the inside, I'm going to go into the middle of my stitches. I'm just going to place my needle in here and then under this loop here. I'm just going to pull it so it's all snug and they sit nicely beside each other. And then I'm just going to start weaving in that end. And that's just how I fasten it off. But as I said, you can fasten off in your preferred method. If you like to slip stitch, go ahead and just slip stitch to join and then cut your yarn, weave in the end. And then you're going to just repeat what we did on this sleeve on the other side. And then once you're done with your second sleeve, we'll come back and we'll do our hem. So now to work the row of half double crochet around the hemline, I'm just going to be joining my yarn to the back right corner of my top. You can join on any side you prefer. That's just where I like to start. So I'm going to take my hook and I'm going to insert my hook into the side of the stitch to the right, to the left of the seam. So just going under the two loops on the side of that stitch. Just going to grab my yarn, drape it over my hook, pull it through. Then I'm going to chain one, and then I'm going to work directly into the side of that stitch again. And then I'm going to work into the side of the stitch again, just a little bit higher. So to evenly work around the hem, you're going to want to place 2 stitches in the side of each double crochet. So again, now I'm just going to go a little higher, and I'm just looking to find another 2 loops to work under on the side of the stitch there. Just going to work a half double crochet there, and I'll come in. So when you're working into the sides of the stitches, what you're going to see is on a row where it's where you started. So for this one here, this is a beginning row where you worked a stack single crochet. You're going to have 2 loops there, and then I'm going to work into this space right here. So I'm going to go under here and into this little space right here. And then on a row where this is where the row ended, you're going to have 2 little loops at the base of the stitch like that. And then closer to the top of the stitch, there's going to be what looks like a little knot. You're just going to stick your tapestry needle under that, those 2 loops, and work a stitch. So work a stitch here, into here, under these 2 loops here, and under this little twisted looking knot right here. And that's how you're going to work across. So let's go ahead and continue. So I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to work under those 2 loops there. Yarn over, working to this space here. Work under these 2 loops here. Under that little twist, that looks like a bit of a knot right there. So now we've worked 4 stitches, so now we've covered 2 rows. And we're just going to continue working around the hemline of our top, just like that, working 2 half double crochet stitches in the side of each double crochet all the way around. And then once you get back to where you started, you're just going to fasten off. So continue working until you get to your center seam where you have the 2 rows of half double crochets. I'll show you where to work into those 2 half double crochet stitches, and then I'll leave you to continue and finish off the hem. All right, so I'm at my center seam, And remember, we have one row of double crochet on half double crochet on this side and another one on that side. So we have to make sure we work into both of those rows. So we're just going to yarn over and find where there's the last two legs of the stitch. Then you're just going to go into the side of the stitch under 2 loops, and you're going to work a half double crochet, and you're going to find the legs of the other one, and then you're going to tilt it sideways where you're going to find the chain, and you're going to yarn over, and you're going to go under 2 loops of that chain one, work a half double crochet, and then you're just going to continue working 2 stitches into the side of each row of double crochet, going all the way around. So just continue doing that all the way around, working into the sides of the double crochets. When you get to the center seam on the other side, work all the way around and then just fasten off and weave in your ends, and then we will be done. All right, we are done and ready to go out and enjoy our breezy tea. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care and bye for now.